I'm going to tell you the chapter story. The first time I met her was because somebody in the club was giving out an apple. And I overheard her say to someone, "Oh, she's good time." And I was right.
I like to see it. I like to see it. I love to see it. The Red Evans family convening once more. All of you are Red Evans family, even if you're here for the first time. I just want you to know you've already been adopted into your family. All right, as soon as you walk through the door. So, good evening, and welcome to Red Evans Bookstore Coffee House, i.e. your brand new location and your brand new home. What do you think? It has been so much fun to begin to host some author events here in the new space, even though we are not technically open. But it really gives the entire team a lot of joy to see so many people turn out and to see folk coming back. You know that this is your radical left home for some conscious thought and all kinds of good things. I am the poet known as Analysis on behalf of the entire team. Welcome you. We are very glad that you got here safely and hope that you get home safely. How many of you are visiting Red Evans of any location for the first time? A good handful of folks. You'll give some noise to yourself. Red Evans started in 2004 down at the corner of St. Paul and Madison. It started as, continues as, and has always been a worker-owned collective. Everybody on the team is either an owner or in position to become an owner. It is an anarchist framework, radical left info shop. That means we have all kinds of dope stuff, both in terms of events and in terms of reading. There is a big bookstore. If you look at those right there, you say, oh wow, I thought the bookstore was going to be big, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. The other 8,000 books are downstairs, all right? And when we get our doors fully open, you'll be able to browse them, and eventually they will come upstairs. So when you go back that way, you see a partition. On this side is a whole other building. We purchased both of these buildings. We purchased this one and we are renovating that side now to become the bookstore. It'll be a beautiful split level thing. We'll take all of the books upstairs, and then the room downstairs will be what's called the Baltimore Free School Classroom. Some of you remember North Avenue, our little side room that we had as the free school. We're bringing that room back together. So I want you to start thinking right now, start planning in your head what type of workshop that you want to teach the community, what your rad left organization might want to do with us in terms of coming to utilize the space for a meeting or for an organizing session. Again, the Baltimore Free School Classroom. So think about it, touch base with your networks in terms of how you might be able to utilize the space. We are a vegan restaurant, so there'll be all kinds of good things coming down the pipe. If we were open, you'd have them in your laptop or at your table right now. Since we're not, I just need you to kind of close your eyes and imagine the bond lead that you're going to be standing down or whatever. I don't know if you can bring the bond leader and all kinds of good things. All right, so you just have to pretend that it's in front of you and that you're like sipping on it and eating it right now. Again, if you wanted to get a coffee drink, you can do that. The book is available, so if you want to tiptoe over there and get that already, many of you have already done so, you can do that, and you can purchase any of the books that you see right over there with my colleague. I want you to follow us at Red Emmas on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, and the website is redemmas.org. Why is this important? Because each of you are a member of the Red Emmas marketing team. You probably didn't know that, but each of you, of course, I know are itching for a chance to tell 3 and 4 people about this event tonight and about the upcoming events. You're about to text them when you get home tonight. I know you are. redemmas.org will tell you what's coming up. I want to let you know about a few things very quickly before we get into our event tonight. I'm very excited for tomorrow night. I'll be here tomorrow night. I hope to see you. How many hip-hop heads in the room? Okay, a handful. How many people like hate misogyny and want to feel good? That's every hand. Good. Psalm 1, Chris Dalbone, who's hip-hop named in Psalm 1, she will be in the house tomorrow night discussing her new book, Her Word is Bomb, navigating the misogynist culture of hip-hop. That's going to be very interesting. That's going to be in conversation with Baltimore's very own Martina Bench, a young hip-hop artist and poet who I've known for many years. She herself is dope, so that's going to be a dope conversation, very much so. We have a few more things I want you to go ahead and go to the website to check out. While I pull some of them up, I'm going to start with my favorite event at Red Emma's, because it's the one I gave birth to. It's called Red Emma's Mother Earth Poetry Vibe. We go quarterly, so we go again in the first part of November. Keep an eye out from there. It is our open mic of peace, justice, poetry, and it always is excellent time. I want you to try to come through next Tuesday on the 4th. Tuesday the 4th, 7 p.m. here. We will hold an anti-fascist roundtable. All right, feminist and anti-colonial resistance will be discussed. That's going to be very interesting. We'll have a 4-person panel, including Baltimore's own organizer, Erica Keynes. We'll be particularly looking at the book for anti-fascist futures, So that is Tuesday the 4th. On Thursday the 6th, Benjamin Smith will be with us presenting the dope, the real history of the Mexican drug trade, and that will be a conversation with someone I know, especially the Baltimoreans know. I'm a very excellent reporter, Brandon Soderbergh. All right, so that's going to get to the real deal behind the media manipulation, behind the lies, and see what is going on with the Mexican drug trade. There are plenty of events. Again, go to redemmas.org so that you can keep up with all of them. Follow us on our social media. Child welfare. So the word welfare right there poses a problem, does it not? Because there's very little well about it, even though we think that there is. And I am really looking forward to tonight's discussion, because even in the short time I've had to begin to crack into the book, I had found it fascinating. I have found it very angering, and already I can tell it is very necessary, because the polemic that our guests will put to us tonight is in terms of not only we know about what we think of as policing on the street and that type of thing, but even in what should be benign systems such as child welfare. Our speaker tonight is going to propose to us that that also is a form of policing, and therefore we should put it in the same efforts of abolition as other things. Professor Dorothy Roberts is the George Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, and there she runs a program called the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society. And I hope that before the night is over, we can also say a little word about that program and how we might be able to tap into that and support that as well. She's the author of a number of crucial works, including the groundbreaking 1998 work, Killing the Black Body. And I know that you'll be talking about some of the connections and ties between that and your other works and what you're talking about this evening. So I need you to make some real radical left red endless noise for Professor Dorothy Roberts presenting
cheering section. So good to be here. I am a newcomer to Red Emma's, but I feel part of the family already. And it's just good to be in this space with people who are dedicated, or at least interested in social justice and radical change and liberation. So I'm going to talk about my book, Torn Apart: How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World. I came to the book, so what I thought I would do, say a little bit about why I wrote the book, how I came to this, read short passages from the book, and then let you know about how the book is structured, and then open it up for Q&A. So I first learned about the so-called child welfare system in the late 1980s when I was beginning to work on my book, Killing the Black Body, which is about the long-standing devaluation of Black women's childbearing, very related to the state of affairs we're in now with the U.S. Supreme Court eviscerating our freedom of reproductive justice. And anyway, I was working on investigating and organizing against the prosecutions of Black women for being pregnant and using drugs. And I discovered that although there were hundreds of Black women who were being prosecuted, turning the issue of drug use while pregnant into a crime, which it had never been before. I discovered that there were thousands and thousands of Black mothers whose babies were being taken from them at birth, and that was, in a way, an even bigger form of oppression than the prosecutions were, and yet I didn't see much outcry against it. I was living in Chicago at the time, and I started to go to child welfare proceedings just to see what it was all about. And I swear to you, all I saw were Black mothers in the court. I learned later that more than 90% of the children in foster care in Chicago were Black at the time. It hasn't changed very much in the last, almost 30 years now. So when I finished writing Killing the Black Body, I decided to do more research on this child welfare system, and I discovered that the disparities, the racial disparities were, the statistics themselves were just staggering. At the time, Black children were the largest group of children in foster care, even though obviously Black children are a minority of children in the United States. In some parts of the country, 1 in 10 Black children or more have been taken from their homes and put in foster care. Black children were 4 times as likely as white children to be placed in foster care. And again, there were some cities like Chicago where it really was a system just for Black families. And I thought, there's no way you could work in this system and not see how racist it is. Unless you believe that the state is taking children, all these Black children away to help their families, which would be very strange in America to have a state institution that was targeting Black people to help Black people, to improve Black people's welfare. So it was clear to me immediately that something was very wrong about this and that it was a form of racial injustice. I then began to meet with mostly Black mothers whose children had been taken from them, and heard the stories of how easy it was for caseworkers to take their children. And it was mostly because of some allegation that they had neglected their children. They had failed to give them medical care or failed to provide adequate housing or food or clothing. And I later learned that, in fact, most of the children in foster care are there on grounds of neglect, not physical or sexual abuse. And I also realized that these children are mostly being taken because of their material needs that their parents weren't fulfilling, but also for reasons that would not have led to child removal if they were a wealthy family. And one example is drug use or alcohol use in the family. I mean, we know that wealthy parents drink and use drugs. We know that wealthy children have mental health problems too. Their children, they don't get taken away. The parents get drug treatment or some kind of private professional help, and their children do as well. I'm not saying that it's all perfect, but the system isn't designed for wealthy white people. It's designed, and always has been designed, for poor people. And that's the fundamental aspect of it. It's a system to deal with poor families' problems, and then in a white supremacist society like ours, it has been used as a tool of oppression, literally to destroy communities. Black communities and also indigenous communities. And you are probably aware that it was used as a weapon of war by the US military to decimate native tribes during the so-called Indian Wars, and then became an official federal policy working with the child welfare system to remove large numbers of native children from their homes and put them up for adoption with white families. Now, this was a deliberate policy of the United States government until the 1970s. And it's no accident that today the two groups of children most likely to be taken are Black and Indigenous children. That history continues to this day. So I am going to read 3 short passages from the book, and then I'll just go over the structure of the book, just to give you a taste of how I've organized it and what else is in it, and open it up for Q&A. Okay. In August 2021, Tyrone Denier, a Black man with a beard and dreadlocks, broadcast an Instagram live video showing armed deputies from the Manatee County Sheriff's Office detaining him, his partner Saisha Mercado, a former American Idol finalist, and their 10-day-old baby. The deputies had pulled the family's car over to the side of the highway to execute a family court judge's order to seize the couple's newborn daughter. The family's nightmare began in February of that year when Mercado and Denier took their 13-month-old son to a hospital in St. Petersburg, Florida to seek medical care. Pregnant at the time, Mercado was having trouble transitioning the toddler from breastfeeding to solid foods and was concerned that he was dehydrated. Hospital staff called the child maltreatment hotline to report that the toddler was malnourished and failing to thrive, and the Department of Children and Families, DCF, took him from his parents. Because Mercado and Denier were under CPS supervision when their daughter was born 6 months later, DCF considered the newborn to be at risk. The couple had hired an attorney to advocate for the return of their son and was embroiled in court proceedings, which led to the judge's pickup order to the sheriff's office. The video Denier posted shows Mercado holding the infant wrapped in a pink blanket as she walks slowly from her car toward 3 white women who appear to be CPS staff, as if she were a condemned convict walking to the gallows. Mercado pauses in front of the workers. "Do you not feel anything?" she asked the women desperately. "You guys, I'm human. This is my baby. My baby is days old, and you're taking my baby away from me. You're taking my baby away from me. You have no heart." As Mercado hands over her daughter, she pleads with the women once more. "My baby is healthy and happy. My baby is breastfeeding from me. What are you going to give my baby?" When the child began to cry, Mercado grows more distraught. "You're traumatizing my baby. You have created so much trauma. I'm not a danger to my baby. It's so wrong. It's so wrong." Then she collapses into Denier's chest, weeping inconsolably. With the help of the viral video, a team of lawyers, and media attention, Mercado and Denier were reunited with their daughter 9 days later, while they continued to fight to recover their son. The terror inflicted by the armed officers who surrounded the peaceful family and the cruelty displayed by the CPS workers who tore the infant from her loving mother leave no doubt that the joint incursion was aimed at criminalizing the parents, not protecting their child. Every year, government agents invade the homes of hundreds of thousands of families in poor and low-income communities without a warrant or any kind of judicial authorization in the name of protecting the children who live there. In 2018 alone, 3.5 million children were involved in an investigation by Child Protective Services, or CPS. Black families are disproportionately subjected to state intrusion. Caseworkers and police officers inspect the premises for what, in their opinion, constitutes a risk to the children. Based on state child neglect laws, the investigators interpret conditions of poverty, lack of food, insecure housing, inadequate medical care, as evidence of parental unfitness. They also perceive the homes in Black communities as more hazardous for children, even when the alleged parental infraction, like allowing a toddler to momentarily stray away or having bottles of alcohol in the house. And I start the book telling the story of a mother who was investigated because her child strayed away from a family picnic for about a minute and a bystander called. She ended up with 7 police officers coming to her home, dislocating her shoulder, hog-tying her, and her name is now in the child abuse registry, so she can't get a job as a nurse, which is what she was going to school for at the time. That's why I mentioned those two. The parents under investigation rarely know their legal rights and aren't informed of them. Asserting their rights is usually futile or may garner a violent reprimand. Caseworkers subject family members to humiliating questioning. They interrogate children separately and pressure them to make statements against their relatives. During these interrogations, caseworkers inspect children for evidence, sometimes strip searching them. Most Black children in America will undergo a CPS investigation at some point in their childhoods. This surveillance constitutes the stop and frisk of Black families that falls off the radar of public protest. Most allegations prompting a child welfare investigation are for neglect. The vast majority of families subjected to investigation have low incomes or are living in poverty and could use help meeting their material needs. But the government agents who investigate them don't offer the resources struggling families need. Instead, they brandish a terrifying weapon against them, the threat of taking their children away. Every year, state child protection agencies make good on that threat and remove about 500,000 children from their homes. Officially, these agencies seize about 250,000 children annually, and it's estimated that they take another 250,000 children through informal coerced arrangements that never make it into official statistics. More than 1 in 10 Black children in America will be forcibly separated from their parents and placed in foster care by the time they reach age 18. The abolitionist mission to liberate Black people from captivity must include freeing family caregivers from state supervision and children from foster care. Ultimately, movements to dismantle different parts of the carceral state are working toward the same world, a world where all children are safe and cared for without the need for police, prisons, and family separation. A more expansive understanding of policing and abolition that contests the state's benevolent terror is essential to collectively building a new society that supports rather than destroys families and communities. This book is dedicated to that abolitionist vision. So let me just go over briefly some of the structure of the book and the topics that I cover, and then we can explore more about it in Q&A. So part 1 I call terror, and that's to explain how terroristic this system is and how it terrorizes families. I start off with chapter 1, Destroying Black Families, just stating some of the statistics that I just did about the huge numbers of families who are disrupted and supervised and surveilled and regulated and traumatized by the system. I don't think most people recognize how massive it is and the kind of trauma it inflicts on people. The next is they separate children at the Harlem border too, and there I'm borrowing from a poster put up by JMAC for Families, an organization in New York City that is working to end the family policing system. system. And by the way, I argued that we should be calling it a family policing system, not a child welfare system, not child protective services, because its aim is to police families, not to improve children's welfare. And they separate children at the harm of order too refers to the fact that many people in America were outraged at former President Trump's policy of separating migrant children at the southern border. And there was a lot of outpouring of evidence of how harmful it is to separate children from their families. The psychological trauma, the trauma to relationships. There were briefs filed in federal court that pointed out that this violates international conventions regarding human rights, and that it can also constitute a form of torture. And yet many people didn't recognize that those numbers paled to the numbers of children who are taken from their families by Child Protective Services every day. And the total number, under Trump's policy was still less than the weekly number in the United States that CPS separates from their families. So I write about the harm of family separation there. And then my chapter 3 is professional kidnappers. This is in t-shirts saying professional kidnappers. They put on social media, fired, but I give them credit for being honest about what they did and point out the kinds of tactics that caseworkers use in order to get to people's homes, investigate them, and disrupt their families. And then part 2 I call design. And there I make the argument that the child welfare system or family policing system is not designed to improve children's welfare. It's been proven not to do that. It's not designed to support families. It's designed to accuse family caregivers and blame them for the unmet needs of their children and regulate them, supervise them, monitor them, break up their families, and in too many cases, permanently terminate the family rights that the legal relationship of families. So I start out with a chapter called Rotten at the Root, where I explain what I said earlier, that we can trace the roots of the system to the Elizabethan Poor Laws that set up a separate system for impoverished families and their problems, and wealthier families, property-owning families that never had to deal with the poorhouse and the almshouse and the original forms of dealing with impoverished children, which was put them with their families in workhouses. Foster care is a reform of that, but it still is taking children away then and putting them into institutions or the homes of strangers. Of course, today there's more kinship care than in the past, but it's still under the supervision of the state. The decimation of Native tribes through child removal, as I mentioned, was a weapon of war developed by the U.S. military. And then I also, then chapter 5 is strong-armed, where I discuss some of the coercive ways that caseworkers and judges deal with families, requiring mandated tasks that they have to fulfill that often have nothing to do with the family's problems. A houseless family may be dealt with by, and often is, the children being put in foster care, the parents being told to go to parent training classes to figure out why they don't have housing for their children, to go to therapy sessions, and not providing housing to them. And then chapter 6 I call the foster industrial complex, and that's about what happens with the upwards of $40 billion that's spent in federal, state, and local funding, mostly on maintaining children outside their homes. The vast majority of money, federal money, 10 times as much money is put into foster care as into providing services to intact families. And again, those services are not what the families ask for. They don't say to families, what is it you need? We will provide it. They say, we're going to tell you what you have to do in order to keep your children or get them back. That's what's called a service. Carceral entanglements. First, family surveillance. So I point out that this is a huge surveillance network over families. And even apart from children going into foster care, I cited some of the numbers. 3.5 million children subject to investigations of some sort based on allegations of child abuse and neglect. And those allegations come into a massive surveillance network of so-called mandated reporters, doctors, teachers, social workers, social service providers, and then child abuse hotlines where anyone can call in and issue a report against you anonymously. You don't even have to say who you are. And there are cases of people who've been investigated just based on an anonymous tip to a child abuse hotline. We know that landlords have used this as a way to evict tenants. Angry ex-partners have used it as a way to get back, and we could go on and on about how this hotline has been abused. Also, I tell the story in the book of a mother who called a domestic violence hotline that she had read about in the New York City subways, and next day caseworkers were knocking on her door, and she ended up with her son taken from her, even though there was no evidence he had been harmed. So instead of getting help for herself to escape the abuse she was experiencing, she lost her son for 5 years to foster care. These agencies are increasingly entering into multi-million-dollar contracts with big digital surveillance companies like IBM, SAS, and others to collect massive amounts of data on the families and their whole social networks. And I'm talking about every record they can get their hands on about families that are reported to the system to gauge through predictive analytics what the risk is. And I don't know if you all have been studying predictive analytics and its role in furthering all sorts of inequities in our society and how these hierarchies get embedded into the data and the algorithms. And police, they're following what police do to find hotspots in cities where they then target for extra police intervention. It's a similar method here where they target certain families and communities for child welfare intervention. Carceral entanglements is the next chapter where I discuss how the family policing system is deeply, deeply entangled with criminal law enforcement, both in its carceral logic, that of punishing people because they need material goods that they can afford. It's just most of the people in prison, that's exactly why they're there. But also the way in which they are physically entangled with police departments, with joint task forces that train together, that go out together. Sometimes you have social workers embedded in police departments or vice versa. And many times when they go into black neighborhoods, they bring police with them. And some of you may have heard stories, read reports of children who've been shot, parents who've been shot by police in the course of an investigation or response to something involving CPS. And then structure to harm is just about the way in which the foster care system, this foster industrial complex, I guess I kind of skipped over that with all the details, but I won't go into all the details. I explain how this foster care not only damages the economic survival of people, but it takes their money. Child welfare agencies around the country take the Social Security benefits of children in foster care, thousands and thousands of dollars that they claim they're entitled to because they're caring for these children, which of course, they've taken the children, they have to care, they have an obligation to care for them, and they take their money and use it to fill holes in the city budget. They don't give the money, it doesn't go to caring for the children who they take it from. And anyway, you have to read about it because it's really deep, the kinds of ways that they are engaged in predation on children that they've taken from their homes. You probably are aware of some of the harms of foster care, but the evidence is just overwhelming that children who spend time in foster care, their relationships are disrupted, their health care is disrupted, their schooling is disrupted, they're more likely to go to juvenile detention, to go to prison, to be houseless, to have low incomes, just to commit suicide, and to be hurt in foster care than the numbers in the general population. Chapter 10 is on criminalizing Black children, where I emphasize this foster care prison pipeline and the way in which foster care puts especially Black teenagers at risk of going into the so-called juvenile justice system. It's so common that they're called in their names for it, dual-involved youth, crossover youth, that the crossover is from foster care into the criminal punishment system, largely because foster care does not support the children when they get in trouble. They're usually abandoned, and abandoned children are more likely to go into the criminal punishment system. Also, runaways, it's a big problem in foster care with children running away. Very often these children end up in the streets, sex trafficked, picked up then by the police, and now they're no longer children to be cared for. They're children to put into juvenile detention or prison, and they also are less likely to have a livelihood that can support them. Finally, my last part and chapter is on abolition and care in place of terror, I call it. And there is where I make the argument that this is not a system that can be fixed. Its fundamental design is oppressive, and therefore the only way of dealing with it justly is to abolish it. And that means to work on dismantling it, to reduce the power that the agents in this system have over families, and at the very same time to be building ways of caring for families and children that doesn't rely on taking children away, and that is truly supportive. It's not based on accusation and coercive services that don't meet children's needs, but actually provide concrete resources to families, and also working on the kinds of broader structural changes we need, like housing for people. If all children had adequate housing, that would drastically reduce the number of children in foster care. If all children had adequate medical care and mental health care, that would as well. So it's both these structural changes and also providing concrete resources for families at the community level that we need to build as a replacement for this punitive, coercive, disruptive, traumatizing, terrorizing system that we have now. So I'll end with that, and I'm really happy to hear your questions and engage in a discussion about the family policing system and what to do about it.
Yes. Drugs necessary now and later when we close the meeting because so much crucial information. We are going to invite questions and we're going to ask that you keep your questions very brief and truncated and try to get as many folk in as possible. We may not be able to get all questions in because there's so much to talk about, but we'll come around with the mic so that you can ask that. All right, so 1 or 2 hands. As folk are formulating questions in their minds, so much you touched on, so much to speak about, and I'm glad you actually included the story about the Arizona workers in Chapter, because I was sitting here earlier today reading a paragraph, and I was getting excited actually, because at first I thought these were some whistleblowers, some activists. And when you read that paragraph in the book, you'll understand why I thought that. And I was like, oh, okay, good. They come with the t-shirts. You know, when did it say I am a kidnapper, professional kidnapper? And I said, some whistleblowing action. And then, as we went on to describe the story, they weren't whistleblowing, they were assholes. They said, why we can't have anything. So, so one of my questions is, in your research, are you finding people from within the system who are actually trying to push back or whistleblow or tell the truth from within those offices, from within those services? That's one quick question. Okay. And I'll give you another one also. We mentioned earlier in our intro. There seems to be, or let me rephrase, this seems a natural follow-up to certainly killing the black body, and it really through the whole series of books in a certain way. And I'm wondering, as you were writing this, if you constantly thought of this as, well, if killing the black body is racism on how we got here, literally, physically, then this is the continued oppression of our childhood, which feeds into the oppression of adulthood and the pipeline, the prison pipeline, that type of thing. So how much consciously was that in your mind? So if you want to deal with either of those, and then we'll go around and get some questions.
Okay. Well, what I'm finding is that there are more and more people who not only, and maybe, I would also draw a distinction here, are working within the system to try to push back against it, but leaving it and telling the truth about it. So one example is there's the current dean of University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work, Alan Detlef, worked as a caseworker for a long time. That was his original profession. And he left and founded an organization called the Upend Movement to abolish the family policing system. And I find it very useful to have honest people who will tell what actually goes on in the system, leaving it and saying, here's what I used to do. I am not going to do it anymore. I'm going to now work against it. And just the other day, he mentioned, well, this was in Twitter, somebody else tweeted about it, but he wrote about this, that it used to be that police officers would come to him, and I've heard this from other caseworkers as well. They want to investigate a family, but they can't get a warrant because they don't have enough evidence that they should be able to enter someone's home. So they go to the caseworker to do it, because caseworkers, although, by the way, they're covered by the Fourth Amendment as well, they should be getting warrants too, but they hardly ever do, because they know that most of the people whose homes they go to don't know that they have a legal right to refuse. And they can terrorize them by saying, if you don't let us in, that means you're guilty of this accusation, which we won't tell you the details of what the accusation is, but you've been accused of something and you risk losing your children forever if you don't let us in. So they can bully their way in. And then once they get in, then they give information to the police, or they have the police accompany them to the house and coming in without a warrant, but they come in on the coattails, literally, of the caseworkers. So, and there's many increasing numbers of people who are leaving family policing and going to various organizations, working with family defenders, legal services attorneys who represent families, and increasingly are putting together multidisciplinary practices that include lawyers, social workers, and then peer advocates, people who have been entangled with the system who now can help others to avoid getting entangled in it. So that's what I'm seeing. There's a big question about whether you can actually make any significant change if you're working within the system, because it has ways of punishing you, disciplining you if you really want to significantly change it. And then, as I said, it's designed to terrorize and punish families. So there's only so much you can do. Now, that doesn't mean that we are going to abolish it right away. So we have to strategize about what are the kinds of incremental reforms that we should engage in order to move toward abolition. And this is what Ruth Gilmore calls non-reformist reforms. They are reforms because they're not tearing down the system right away, but they're actions that will diminish the power of the system moving toward abolition. And that's the question of who can you collaborate with to do that. Not everyone is an abolitionist, but they may still be willing to work on some of these reforms. And it's a question, I think, that if you are engaged in abolitionist work, you just have to collectively figure out what is truly abolitionist and what isn't. In terms of killing the black body, as I said, I learned about the family policing system while working on that book, because if you work at all with black mothers who have been punished by the state, one way, you're going to find that they're being punished another way as well. And that's why working on opposing the prosecutions of black women for being pregnant, I learned that they were also being punished for having babies. I mean, it is logical and the next step, as you said. And I just mentioned one other aspect of it, which is that when we think about the way in which black women's childbearing was exploited by enslavers, and the importance of black women's reproductive labor, extracted reproductive labor to racial capitalism and slavery, that then also was related to the legal ownership of enslavers of children, of black children, and the authority they had over these children, and extending into the post-civil rights, the Civil War era, when emancipated black children were re-enslaved virtually to their former enslavers by courts on grounds that their parents neglected them through the apprenticeship system. So, these are very connected forms of oppression. And this is also something that reproductive justice activists have long said, that reproductive justice involves not just the human right not to have a child, but the human right to have a child and to parent your child in a society that values your child. And so, yes, I see them as very much connected. And now today with the Dobbs decision, finding that there's no constitutional protection for abortion and compelling birth without any kind of legal protection against it, again, conjuring up the compelled slavery, that gets connected to family policing, because one of the arguments that anti-abortion advocates are making is that, well, you can just put your child up for adoption. I'll adopt your baby. A lot of these protesters, I don't know whether they just won, but yeah, they put up the sign, I'll adopt your baby. And as you know, Justice Amy Coney Barrett in the Dobbs argument says, put them in safe havens, and then Alito in the majority opinion also, he has to say, I don't know if you've read the opinion, he puts in the opinion that this is a good argument that you can just put your baby up for adoption and people in America can feel secure that their baby will find a loving home. And then he drops a footnote about the need for a supply of babies because of the demand for adoption. And this is written in the opinion. So here again is this connection between reproductive oppression and family policing. Because what is really going to happen to these children who are born to struggling families is that they're going to come under the watch of the child welfare system, the family policing system. And it's not the case that if you drop off your baby, you can be guaranteed the baby is going to find its way into a loving home. It may find its way into foster care and all of the harms of foster care. So, I could go on about that as well, but there are so many connections. These are all issues of state control of reproduction, of our reproductive lives, our bodies, all also fueled by deeply racist stereotypes about Black families, and the idea that Black families don't have loving bonds, so you can break them up at will, and it's not really, it'll be better for the children. But then the ultimate devaluation of Black children as well, because they are not very well in this system and are disproportionately put into these facilities that are like prisons.
I did not know about the legal line in the Dobbs. That's fascinating.
Professor Roberts, how you doing?
Good.
All right, good.
Good.
I'm Joyce Huggins, former foster parent and adopted parent. First of all, I want to appreciate you and thank you for the work that you're doing and highlighting the deficiencies in the system. Being in it from 9 months to aging out, going to college, doing the whole thing.
Yes.
I can tell you it's been a crazy ride.
Yeah.
I have 2 quick questions for you. So you mentioned in your book, in the last chapter, pretty much overhauling the foster care system. You mentioned community involvement. I just want to know from your purview, what does that actually look, what does that investment or involvement actually look like, both financially and via services?
Yeah. So ultimately, it means providing for families what they need to take care of children. The concrete resources people need: groceries, housing, medical care, clothing, all of the human needs that people and children, including children, have, and figuring out how to provide that. Now, there's some examples of that already through mutual aid networks that are being created. We know that in New York City, for example, a professor at NYU, Anna Ahrens, has written an article about how during the COVID lockdown, when people thought that children were going to be abused in their homes because ACS wasn't doing its investigations. In fact, there is no evidence of increased abuse, and she attributes it to the outpouring of concrete material resources that mutual aid networks in the city poured out to people, delivering groceries to people, diapers, food, other forms of food, mental health care, just providing what people need to thrive. As I also said, that isn't going to be enough because people need homes to live in, and communities right now just don't have the resources to build enough homes for people. I think this is a subject of debate and discussion, but I think that we have to have a major shift in government policy and what money is spent on. And it shouldn't be spent on building prisons and giving money to police. It should be spent on building homes, decent housing for people, and making sure there is affordable housing or free housing, that's decent, that's high quality for people. I believe that we need a universal high quality health care for everybody. Universal college education, high quality college education for everybody. Just, again, meeting people's basic needs to thrive in a society. And again, what concretely would that look like? To me, the best examples are mutual aid networks, but I think we do need to think about where the massive amount of money that would be required to truly end childhood poverty, for example, in America, where is that going to come from? I know some people say, well, we shouldn't rely on the federal government at all. I don't know. I don't have a problem with taking all the billions and billions of dollars they spend on the military and police and prisons and investing that to meet the needs of people. Another reason why Professor Aaron says that there was no spike in child abuse in New York City during the lockdown was that people were getting more money from the federal government. They were getting checks, no strings attached, to meet their needs. There's all these articles coming out now about how childhood poverty has gone down in America because people are getting more concrete resources, food and benefits. And it's, surprise, surprise, if you give people income, they're less poor. I don't know why we need studies to show this, but the studies are showing that. Yeah, so that's some of what I and others are thinking about and already putting in place. But it requires a lot of work because the U.S. has such profound inequality, income inequality, wealth inequality, that it's going to take a lot to, it's even saying to close the gap. I mean, obviously, we need radical change if we're really going to end childhood poverty, which is the main reason why we have this system. We have this system as a substitute for the kind of society we should have. That's right. That's one of the reasons why I say it has to be abolished. Because as long as it's there, people can think they can rely on it. But the people who are entangled in it know they can't rely on it. It's other people who say, well, you need to rely on the child welfare system or on family policing to meet your needs. People who have no fear that they're at risk of their children being taken from them.
So I guess my follow-on question to that is, when you talk about getting the community the resources they need,
Yeah.
it's kind of like the chicken or the egg question. Is it, do we provide them with the education necessary so that they can properly articulate their needs? Or do we just throw a bunch of money at them and hope that if things get, that they use it in the way it's supposed to be used? And I say,
Well, I guess I believe that people know what they need and they know how to spend money on it. That's just my understanding, what I have seen, what I believe is, as soon as we start judging people at whether they're spending the money correctly, we're going to perpetuate the same kind of systems we have now. People know, someone who is houseless knows that they need someplace to live. Now, that's not to say, I'm not trying to dismiss your question altogether.
No.
I think that, yes, it's important for people to have education and skills, and I also think that it's important to raise the consciousness of people who maybe don't understand how the system works. There are people who are being victimized by the system, who are being exploited by the system, who don't know all the ins and outs of it. As I mentioned, many people don't know the rights that they have. They don't know that the Fourth Amendment, I think that most Americans don't recognize that the Fourth Amendment applies to any government agent who wants to search your home, including a caseworker from Child Protective Services. So it's not, there's a lot of education that many people should have, not just the people who are the most impoverished. I think I was asked about my program on race, science, and society. I do a lot of work also on ending the myth that race is a biological trait. A lot of my activism and talks and writing is against the rise of the idea that race is a natural division of human beings. And most of the people I'm trying to educate about that are highly educated people. They are talking about supposedly brilliant genetic scientists who think that Black people are a distinct race that are biologically different, and that all of our problems are caused by genetic predispositions. And, these are supposedly highly educated. I have to give lectures to medical students where a study recently found that a substantial number of them at University of Virginia Medical School believe that things like Black people have thicker skin than white people. So when I say we need education, I'm not just talking about the most impoverished people. I think people know what they need. It's actually the elite who need to be educated about a lot of things. But we all need more education. We all need more understanding of each other and how the world works, how the universe works. So I'm not putting down education by any means.
I think just to articulate my question was not necessarily the education as a whole, but like sometimes if you don't know where the resource is, you can't apply for it. And that was more or less the
that's
education I
very
was
true.
working on.
Okay, well, that's very true. I mean, we know that they deliberately make it difficult for people to get benefits they're entitled to by making it complicated. And that was one of the points one of the studies showed, that just by making it easier to get the benefits you're entitled to, people are more likely to get them. So one part of an abolitionist activism now is, for example, I mentioned Joyce McMillan before with the billboards. So Jane Mackford Families has a legislative network that is working on legislation in New York that would require caseworkers to give families Miranda rights, to tell them what their rights are. Just as one example. So yeah, I agree with you that education should be part of abolition. Absolutely. we have to, I mean, I feel like I'm engaging in education in this discussion now. If people don't know about this system, for example, I think that the US public needs to be educated about the harms that it inflicts and its history and its design. So I agree with that too.
Thank you.
Thanks for your questions. Yeah,
Hi, good evening, Professor Roberts.
Thank you.
Just want to thank you for a book I cannot wait to read. I would like to publicly identify myself as one of the people who did perpetuate this. I was a social worker in the early 2000s, starting in '01, and worshipped without question at the feet of the child welfare,
Yeah.
the family policing.
Right.
New language is going to kick in. The family policing system.
Yeah.
And even though I do not work in the family policing system anymore, and I actually do legal work with adults, and I have a question about it, kind of part of my penance, quite honestly, is learning more about this and reading this book and talking to people. And so I just want to thank you for providing me with that knowledge.
Sure, and thank you. I mean, you're one of the people, hopefully you'll become even more of one, that I'm talking about people who have worked in the system and left it. And if they're honest about it, I think, and don't want to defend themselves, you know, this is a big problem, trying to justify what they know was wrong.
Harmful.
It was harmful.
That I did harm,
Yeah.
and I know that.
Yeah.
But the work that I do now actually is, I think, kind of at the intersection of both books. I provide legal services to people who trade sex, either through choice, circumstance, or because they're being trafficked.
Yeah.
And what we see in terms of intersections with that population is the mere fact of trading sex will get you a family policing report.
Yes.
And so I just was hoping, you could maybe comment a little on that intersection, because it's really not something outside of the communities who are impacted that people talk a lot about. Just that intersection between just the mere fact of, and quite honestly, meeting your family's needs. Children are taken away.
Yeah.
And the mere fact of trading sex is used regularly against families and child custody proceedings and divorces. So I was just hoping you could comment a little on that. And again, thank you for allowing me to do my penance for the harm I caused.
You're welcome. There's a lot of work, good work you can do, believe me. There's so many intersections between sex work, sex trade, sex trafficking, and they're not all the same thing. I'm not saying it all, they're all the same thing.
No, they're not.
Right. So, and I mentioned the way in which children who run away from foster care sometimes some of them are exploited into sex work, and there are examples of foster care group homes where they're a place where sex traffickers go. I have examples of that in the book. And then the children are then punished when they're caught by the police, because it's typical for child welfare departments when they're runaways to send the police after them. You know, that's how they approach it. They don't say, why do we have so many children running away from this helpful, wonderful system we put them in? You know, they say something's wrong with them.
We're fighting that fight in trying to pass safe harbor to try to stop the criminalization of these young folks.
Right, yes.
With regard to the adults.
And then the adults
get their children taken away.
Well, because this is a system that, if I'm going to say broadly, it targets marginalized people. You know, whether we're talking about marginalized by race, by gender, by sexual orientation or identity, by class, by immigration status, you know, all these are the people that this system targets, the most marginalized communities. And look at in Florida, Texas. I mix up these two states all the time now because they have this, dueling policies, which one can be the most oppressive. But Greg Abbott in Texas wanted to go after trans kids and their parents. So what did he do? He issued an order that Child Protective Services should investigate families that support transition of trans children as a form of child abuse. It's over and over again, it's used as a weapon against people who are seen as breaking whatever the societal standard is. And people who engage in the sex trade are seen as breaking those norms, and so they are targets for Child Protective Services. Same thing with people who experience intimate violence. I mentioned the one mother I talk about in the book who lost her son for 5 years because she called a domestic violence hotline for help. This is very typical for mothers who themselves have survived violence to be seen as unfit. This is what it's, who is perceived as an unfit parent, which means who is seen by our dominant societal standards as not deserving of being a parent. And Black parents fall into that category in general in America. Black mothers, there's a stereotype that we don't really love our children. We transmit a deviant lifestyle to them, sometimes through our very bodies. These were the ideas about crack babies that came up in the 90s, but certainly through our example. And Black fathers just aren't supposed to exist at all. There's so many examples in the child welfare system where Black fathers are treated as just per se absent. There's no consideration of them whatsoever because they're assumed to not have a relationship with their children. And if they do, it's not a good one. And this also, mass incarceration comes into this because, we know that a large number of Black men and women, but Black men is a larger percentage, have become entangled in the criminal punishment system. And that is a reason for them not to have custody of their children. And so sex work fits right into that as well. Drug use is another one. The idea that if you use drugs, you're a bad parent, especially if you're poor, and especially if you're Black or Native. It's okay if you're wealthy or white. You can even boast about it, and you don't have to worry about losing your children. I point out in the book, during COVID, people on social media who joked about drinking and using drugs to cope having the stress of their children at home. And that was as funny or entertaining or helpful advice, but there was no sense that, we need to now go in and take their children away from them. But believe me, there are thousands and thousands of poor white or Black, whether they're poor or not, families and Native families whose children have been taken from them because of drug use. And drug use is not a sign of parental unfitness. And so the equation of drug use and being a bad parent is just a false equation, but it's part of the whole war on drugs in the United States, this idea that drug use is the most dangerous thing, when in fact we know that it's the war on drugs that has caused far more harm to communities than the drugs themselves. And even in a case where, it's not to say that people don't have substance use problems that they need help with, but if you're wealthy, you sign up for drug substance abuse treatment, and your kids don't get taken from you. But if you're poor you are mandated to engage in it while your children are in foster care. And it's just a very different approach to the issue of drugs. But drugs, Movement for Family Power, another abolitionist organization in New York, wrote a report that family policing is ground zero for the war on drugs. That's where it's going on. One example is even in states that have legalized marijuana use, they will still go after parents who smoke marijuana, even though it's legal. So there's, part of what you're saying. Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Preeti Kanodian, another person that was formerly working. I actually worked in federal policy. Worked at HHS, sorry for the alphabet soup, worked at HHS in congressional affairs during the passing of Family First.
Yeah.
So, I know well.
That would be so, I'd love to hear the inside scoop of that.
Lots of stories.
Because I'm sure that was negotiated.
It was, and the thing with it was the system worked. Because it had bipartisan, bicameral support.
Right.
People were actually talking to each other and making policy.
Right.
And yet the end result is not what anybody wants.
Yes. Yeah.
I actually, because of that and many other things, shifted gears, became a doula with Ancient Song.
Oh, wow. Oh, cool.
So it was through that I was able to articulate exactly what was wrong with the child welfare system, working in that policy space.
Yeah.
But my question for you is sort of at that policy level and honestly at sort of the economic capitalistic level.
Right.
Even the advocates in that system, in that complex, Casey and all of the others,
right.
they're not trying to make a change.
Right.
They are actively supporting the system in order to continue to benefit from it.
Yeah.
The states are, right, like the money isn't going to TANF, it's going into child welfare instead because the states get to keep controlling that money.
Right.
So just sort of that non-reform reform.
Yeah.
How do we get there when the money and the players that are supposed to be advocates aren't there?
Yeah. It's really hard. I mean, you're speaking to that chapter I have on the foster industrial complex and all the people that have an investment in keeping the system fundamentally the way it is, because Casey is going to say, well, we are engaging in reform. We are trying to make it less traumatic and reduce the foster care population and provide services. I mean, for some of you who don't know, Family First Act was recently passed, and it's supposed to reduce foster care by one of its aims, by providing these services to families who are at risk of going into having children placed in foster care. Now, it's already set up to target the families that they have identified as needing to have their children taken from them, and then the services are imposed on them. So again, it's the same underlying philosophy. It's not a philosophy of giving people what they say they need. It's, we've identified you as a bad parent, a risky parent, whose children are at risk of going into foster care, and we will force you to do what we tell you to do, or we're going to take your children from you. It's this, it's the same thing. So, what do you do with all of this investment of nonprofit organizations, the people who work for the system, the people in the government who want to see it going? So first of all, I think we do have to call out that there's a difference between abolishing the system and reforming it, and call out that these agencies that, they have so much, it's the government funders, but also the private funders that have so much power. I've just seen it for so many years that when you have that combination of federal funding that goes to nonprofit organizations that, you know, have to compromise to get it. I have been in so many places where these nonprofits are mad at me because I've criticized, just like you are, what they're doing. I'm sure Andy Casey would be very mad at this conversation, right? And believe me, I've done reports for them. That's why I say, turnabout, I've tried all this. I have been hired by Andy Casey to work on projects and write reports. You know, I'm tired of writing a report almost 30 years ago for them, and nothing has changed. So I know that there's a difference between these reforms that just make the system look a little bit nicer, but it really isn't. It spreads. In fact, Family First could spread the reach, because now it looks like, oh, it's good, we're providing service, so now we can bring more families in. You know, it's not just the families that, oh, there's evidence these children are at risk. Oh, no, there might be a risk in the future. And so now you're sucked in too, right? So one thing is to make just to be willing to say, like you are now, this reform is not going to create the radical change we need. It's just going to perpetuate what we have already. To be willing to say that, because many people will not say that because they've got the gravy train that's coming to them if they participate in these things. And so making that distinction, calling it out, and then we have to figure out, you know, as I was saying before to the other question, you have to have money to provide the resources. We have to figure out how we can either change the people in government who are making these decisions, or figure out how to develop economically, you know, our own resources in our communities that we can use to provide and meet human needs. I mean, I can't answer that question. You know, I can tell you what the problem is and what we have to do, but this is something we have to work on collectively. You know, I can't answer it by myself. I just know that I now understand the difference, and I now understand that I do not want to work on reforms anymore. I want to work on abolishing the system, and I want to work with people who have that vision, and we are strategizing to accomplish it, both by dismantling the system we have now and drastically diminishing step by step its power and refusing to work with it, okay, and developing ways of meeting people's needs apart from the family policing system. And you know, it's happening, but it's going to take a lot of work, it's going to take a lot of commitment, and we have to come together and do the work. And we know, but we know the thing is, we do have examples. You know, there's small examples, but we have examples, and we also have historical examples. You know, we know of communities in the past that have been able to sustain themselves. We know that there have been changes in policy that have sent money into communities at certain times. I mean, usually there's a backlash and they get closed down, but we know it can happen, and we have to have that hope based on our commitment that we cannot keep terrorizing families like this. We cannot accept it. You know, that we just can't, so we have to do something. We have to work toward abolition.
No more powerful coda could we have, I believe, on to a discussion that we need a whole other session on. But our speaker's given us the call in terms of working collectively and the fact that we need to move towards the abolition of this type of stupidity. Before we get one more round of applause, I want to remind you that we still have copies of the book. Many of you already have it, some of you do not yet. So not only is Torn Apart available, but also Killing the Black Body. Any books that you see here this evening, you can also purchase with you and also will be available for signatures, and that way you can slide in that one last little bit of statement and questioning. Be sure, because you are on the Red Emer's marketing team, to take a look at the upcoming events, send them to your friends, your family, your crew. Hopefully I will see you tomorrow for one, and let us finally give another big round of applause to Professor Dorothy Roberts. It's going to have